Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Roy, and I pastor a local church with my wife Jinha, and I also support church plants here in Victoria. And I just want to thank you for the invite to come and spend the morning with you and share a message with you all. Now, I understand that Fraser is off in the U.S. doing a ministry tour and going to Exponential as well. And I was just kind of thinking we'll have to keep Julie in prayer as she single parents an army of cat and girls. I asked Fraser before he left. I was like, "Hey, you know Disney World is right next to Exponential, right?" And he's like, "Yes." And I was like, "Are you going?" And he said, "No." And I was like, "Oh, you're going to work. Good on you." Now, my wife is also heading to the U.S. for the same reason next week, so I'm just trying to brace myself as I single parent my boys. Um, Speaking of Adventist education, our two boys attend Nunawading Christian College, and unfortunately, we live in Coburg, and so the morning commute, well, it's very special, and I'll just leave it at that. So if you're praying for Julie, please pray for our family as well. That would be much appreciated. So not too long ago, Fraser came to our church and preached a sermon on self-control. And as he finished the sermon, I just thought, this is such a good message. I mean, it was probably one of the best sermons I've heard in a long time. So when Jared tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, we're still going through that series on Proverbs. Can you cover a message that's specific to this book?" I thought this is going to be really, really tricky. And I thought, well, I've got some thoughts on forgiveness, so I'll pick forgiveness as a theme. And so he said, "Okay, that works." It's like, great. So much later, I start sermon prep, and let's see if I have some slide control. Okay, great. I did a quick word search on forgiveness, and this was the result. And I thought, you know what? The problem is I've put in the word forgiveness, and I need to put in the word forgive. So this was the result. And I thought, this is a problem. You know what? Berwin is going to get a repeat sermon on self-control. That's what's going to happen. Well, what I thought is, surely forgiveness is part of the way of the wise. Like, surely Solomon believed in forgiveness. And so I had to do some more researching, and here's what I found. Now, Solomon, he doesn't use the word forgiveness or the word grace in the way that we understand it. And that depends on which translation you use. But there are a handful of passages that address the concept of forgiveness. And I want to share that with you this morning. So our first passage is found in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12. And this reads, "Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins." Here's another passage, Proverbs 11:13. "Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered." So throughout the book of Proverbs, this concept of covering is used, and it serves as this Hebrew metaphor for forgiveness. And I guess to clarify the metaphor, we really need the book of Leviticus to add valuable insight to this concept of covering. So in chapter 16 of Leviticus, we have something called the Day of Atonement. And the word atonement, it means covering. So it's the Day of Covering. And in chapter 16, we have this theme of covering that permeates the chapter. And so in verse 13, we have this priest that goes into the sanctuary and he lights this smoky incense. And as he lights the incense, this cloud kind of wafts into the sky and it covers the most holy place. It covers God. Then the priest goes into the sanctuary with the blood of a goat and he begins to cover different pieces of furniture in the sanctuary. And that also provides this idea of forgiveness. So these practices, along with an offering, provides this promise where God communicates to Israel, "I forgive you, I desire connection with you." It provides this covering of safety for Israel, even in the midst of their sin. There's something about covering that teaches us about God. In Scripture, God, he's shrouded in mystery. So for example, if you look at some stories in the Old Testament, God is covered in this cloud. You move on to another story, God is covered in this pillar of fire, and sometimes he's covered in a tabernacle or a tent. The person of God is just not seen in Scripture. About a year and a half ago, we were having family worship, And my 7-year-old, he asked this question: how do you know God is real? And we were talking about the goodness of God, and here my 5-year-old was going through this existential crisis and just asking this very genuine question: I can't see God. Why do you believe in him? Now, I hadn't actually brushed up on my apologetics to toddlers at that time, and so I kind of launched into this, prayer is a great way of connecting with God, and I just kind of thought, do I talk to him about subjective morality? Like, what do I do in this situation? And at the end of the conversation, my 5-year-old then goes, well, it's just difficult, isn't it? And so I look at my wife and I go, our 5-year-old's an atheist. Drew us to our knees. God is just inherently mysterious. When God talks to Moses, he tells him, no one can see me and live because my glory is just too great to bear. And for that reason, I'm to remain hidden. I think the mystery of God, it's this genuine challenge to faith. However, it's that same covering of mystery that keeps us alive. For example, the biggest star in our solar system, the sun, it's life-giving, but it's also dangerous. The moment you remove the distance between us and the sun, it's the moment that it ceases to be life-giving. We need God to be covered. See, the Old Testament, it's not just about God covering himself. It's also about God covering us, which we alluded to in Leviticus. In Isaiah chapter 61, verse 10, I just want to highlight a few ideas about covering. The first idea, the protective covering that is given to us, which is referred to in Isaiah 61 as a robe, it's given through sacrifice. So in other words, you cannot separate the gift of covering from the sacrifice or the cost incurred by the one who offers the covering. Jesus, he had to die, and his blood had to be shed in order for us to be clothed in salvation. This is closely connected to the second idea. In 1 John chapter 1, verse 7, the blood of Jesus, his son, it purifies us from all sin. That covering from God, it's not just a superficial covering, it's a cleansing agent. So when we recognize that Jesus didn't have to die for us, it produces transformational gratitude. So I encourage you, I don't know if you're like me, but there are moments where the gift of salvation doesn't feel like a gift. Because if I don't respond to that salvation, then I feel like I'm lost. And I don't know if you've ever felt like that, where that journey of transformation feels like a chore rather than a gift. And this one idea that God didn't have to send Jesus. Jesus could have said, yeah, I'm actually good. I don't want to do this. That changes the framework and the perception of how we encounter that relationship with God, especially when it comes to salvation. So I encourage you, if you have a thoughtful moment to meditate through Psalm chapter 51, it will shift your perception of salvation. The final idea that I want to touch on in regards to covering, the covering that keeps God a mystery also helps reveal who he is. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the heart of God is easier to see when you cannot see the person of God. There was a time when God physically revealed himself to the world, and the world responded by nailing him to a tree. But after the resurrection of Jesus, there was no physical evidence of the body of God. He is again covered in mystery. So then the disciples, they begin to teach that there's forgiveness for humanity. And they begin teaching, you can't see God, but you can see his heart. And the result is that Christianity becomes the largest religion in the world. So in the book of Proverbs, Solomon uses this metaphor of covering to communicate several things. One, God is covered in mystery, but it is that mystery that reveals his heart. And by connecting to God's covering, we can then engage and encounter the power of forgiveness. Proverbs chapter 17:19 says, whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. In this passage, Solomon says the practice of covering fault has the power to repair relationships. The Bible connects two different ideas that I want to spend some time on: relational healing and missional development. In John chapter 13, verse 34, Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another." And my question as I read this passage is, well, how does God love? And in Romans 5:8, we have that very famous verse, "But God shows his love to us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So the forgiveness of God, it creates this relational healing. But when we move on to the very next verse, verse 35, Jesus continues on, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So here in this next verse, the relational healing translates to missional development. I like this verse because it shows that I like this verse because we have the identity of God's last day people found in John chapter 13. Now, a very Seventh-day Adventist sermon is going through the book of Revelation and highlighting Revelation chapter 14. And here it says, we have the identity of God's last day people. It's those that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. And I think the passage is important because it shows how God identifies, those people belong to me. They believe in Jesus and they keep the commandments of God. But John chapter 13, it talks about how people outside of the church identify God's people. See, people outside of the church, they may not care if we have faith in Jesus or if we keep the commandments of God, or at least most of them. But what they do want to know is, do you guys get along with each other? Do Christians know how to forgive? And so Jesus here says, "By this shall all people know that you belong to me, if you have love for one another." Relational healing is foundational to missional development. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32, Paul here lists things that we struggle with when it comes to forgiveness. And if you look at the beginning of the verse, he talks about bitterness, anger, shouting, and slander. This is a very real list. But how does one get to the point of letting go of these things? How do I let go of bitterness? How do I let go of being angry? Because sometimes it makes me feel good. Sometimes shouting feels necessary. Anyone have that one person, when they walk into the room, it just unsettles you? And then you have to plan that whole event around that one person, because I will not let this one person make me look bad. Does one just decide, today, I'm going to let this bitterness go? I'm not going to get angry. How does that work? Paul here in this passage, he gives some great tips to forgiving. He says that you can remove bitterness, anger, and the rest of the list by showing kindness and compassion to one another. There's this famous quote, "Bitterness is the poison we drink, hoping somebody else will die." And the trouble is, feeding that bitterness doesn't actually make it go away. It just festers. I came across this one quote, and it reads, "When you give up your right to hurt those who hurt you, that brings an end to your hurt." It's so counterintuitive and difficult, but try it. Do something nice for somebody when you feel bitterness towards them. So last year, the day before my wife's 40th birthday, we got into an argument. And we hadn't argued in a long time. But for one reason or another, this argument was just, it was one of those bad arguments. And there I was, sitting in my bed the night before her 40th birthday, and I had to decide, do I follow through on my preparations for her 40th birthday, or do I give her what she deserves, which is nothing? And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to end up single if I do that. And so the next day rolls around, and I'm like, I need to take responsibility and go to the shops and prepare for her 40th birthday. And so I go and I'm like looking for a present for her, and something strange happens as I start looking for a gift for this woman that I love. Instead of fixating on the things that she said or the misunderstanding that took place or how I felt, I started thinking about all the nice things this person has done. I started thinking about how much this woman means to me and how she's an amazing mother to my children. And so, as I'm going from shop to shop, in that brief moment of time, it actually took away that bitterness in my heart. And I just remember thinking, man, this works. Now, I don't want to paint an unrealistic picture. We still had to have hard conversation. And it's not like we were then dancing through a field of flowers after that. Like it was a challenge. But what I'm saying is, in that moment of trying to do something nice for the person that I was upset with, it alleviated the difficulty of that bitterness. Paul also says in Ephesians 4, forgive one another in Christ, just as God also forgave you. Now, often when I'm in the valley of bitterness and guilt, I feel two things at the same time. I feel frustration for what the other person did to me and how they made me feel. And at the same time, I feel guilt for how I've treated the other person. And those two things are very difficult to shake. But here, Paul's advice is, instead of fixating on what has been done to you or what you did, fixate on what God has done in Christ for the sake of humanity. And this doesn't always happen, but there are moments when I practice this, it has the power to change how I see myself. It changes how I see those I'm in conflict with. And I suppose in forgiveness, it just has the power to reframe those hurtful moments. See, God can change how you perceive yourself and others. When I was engaged to my wife, our families hadn't met each other. Jinha was living on the East Coast in the U.S., and I was living on the West Coast in the U.S., and we had met at Andrews University, so almost in the middle. And as our relationship was developing, we just kind of thought it'd be good to get our parents to meet each other. And so we talked to both sides of the family. They said, yep, this date works. And Jinha's family was going to fly over to visit us on the West Coast. And so we clear everything. We make our plans. I clean the house. I get everything ready. And the day before Jinha's family arrives, I go to my dad and I double check. Hey, you're ready for Jinha's family to arrive, yeah? And he's like, what? And I was like, no, I covered this with you. I was like, this is very important because my potential wife, her family wants to meet you. You need to be here. And he's like, I don't know if I can take time off work. And I was very unhappy with him. And we had this conversation and he was just dead set. I don't know if I can take time off work. And I said something along the lines of, if this relationship falls apart, it's your fault. And, I'm this son living under my dad's roof, and I kicked him out of my room. And, there was just this long period of time where he would kind of check to see if I was okay, where he'd open the door and poke his head in. And I was like, you're not coming in here. And he, he just he kindly, stepped out and went downstairs and he did some work. And, after a long period of time, I said it was a day before. It was actually about a week before. As days went by, and basically I was like, you know what, I need to get out of the house because I'm just like staying in my room and I'm angry and I'm fearful of my future. And my dad's office is like right next to the exit of the house. And as I get dressed and I go down, I see my dad. And like he's aware that I'm there, and he kind of briefly puts his head up, and I kind of gave him the dirty eye, like you, and just as I put my hand on the door to exit the house, there's like this sense of conviction. You need to go make things right with your dad, because whether you like it or not, like Jinha's family is gonna be here, and what are you gonna do? Like, you need to make this right with your dad. And as he's sitting at his desk, I walk over to him and I touch his hand, and it's at that moment where he looks up and he stands up and he just gives me this big hug. And I'm trying to get out, I'm sorry that I've been so mean to you over the last few days. And then he cuts me off and he just says, I'm so sorry. I'm such a bad father. And he keeps repeating that. And we're both saying sorry to each other, but it was kind of in the embrace where we're both communicating, like, it's okay. Like, I love you, right? And there's something about forgiving that reframes our identity and what we've done that's incredibly powerful and transformational. There are a couple of misconceptions of forgiveness that I think are worth mentioning. There are many examples of abuse that takes place. Forgiveness is not excusing another's hurtful action. I think in this context, forgiveness is more about letting yourself off the hook for what is being done to you. It's okay to seek help. It's okay to create distance for yourself and your loved ones. Here's another misconception. Forgiveness, it does not negate restitution. The fact that someone has taken something away from you doesn't mean that you have to give up your right for recompense. And I think where forgiveness is useful is that when you go through that process of forgiveness, it helps you know, should I actually try and get recompense? Is this necessary? Is this right? So often when I talk about forgiveness in churches, people come out to me and they share how difficult forgiveness can be. And I think the reality is that it is very, very challenging. It's a journey. And for me, asking a couple of questions is quite helpful. Like, if I begin to ask that question, what am I losing by not forgiving? That then creates this framework, or I guess this space where I can work through, okay, where am I at here? How is my bitterness impacting those around me? And what is this doing for the community around me? So my dad, he is one of the most forgiving people that I know. To a fault is how I usually describe him. Um, when I was 15 years old, my mother passed away. She had a stroke and basically didn't recover, had a second stroke, and she was just in a coma. And basically, my dad had to go through this process of, what do I do? Do I try to keep her on life support, or do I just let nature take its course and let her rest? And he decided to go for the latter. Well, while that was a very difficult thing to process, time had passed by. And I don't know if it's like this in the Burwood Community Church, but I grew up in an ethnic church, and there's something that we call, like, it's the auntie network, where the aunties know everything. Like, all the important communication goes through the aunties. And my dad gets this tap on the shoulder, tap, 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 and they're like, oh, Mr. Kim, like, we know you've been single for a while. There's this other lady in another state. We want to know, like, would you like to get to know her? And my dad, of course at the time, he's like, yeah, I need to, like, it's time to move on with life. And he goes to my brother and he says, hey, this I guess the situation has arisen. How do you feel? And my brother goes, yeah, of course. You've got to go out and meet people. So then my dad comes to me and he says, hey, Roy, like, the situation has arisen. Like, how do you feel about this? And I was like, you are going to stay single until Jesus comes. Like, you are not allowed to meet anybody. And my dad, he kindly goes, okay, and he waits for me. And like, years. And finally my brother comes to me and he's like, hey, you've got to let our dad meet somebody else. You can't just, like, cling on to this unrealistic expectation. And I reluctantly said, okay, fine, you can go meet somebody else. So then the auntie network is at work, and they come to him again and they say, hey, there's this lady up in Canada. Would you like to go meet her? And my dad says, yes, I would like to go meet her. And so he drives up to Canada, and him and this lady, they start dating. And about 2 years passes by, and he goes, okay, well, I think it's time to, like, take the relationship to the next step. And so they start talking about marriage. And as they're having this discussion, my dad goes, hey, look, I really need you to know that I am not a man of means. Like, we're not wealthy. This is going to be a challenge. I just want to let you know in advance. And the woman looks at my dad and says, I love you. Don't worry about this. We'll make it work. Well, 1 year passes by, and she begins to feel just what that means. And the arguments start happening, and the house becomes this difficult place, because when you don't have the means to make it work, life is stressful. Well, things didn't work out, And this woman said, I can't do this anymore. She packed her bags and drove back up to Canada. So I remember looking at my dad as she left, going, this man lost his first wife, and now he's lost his second wife. Well, time went by, and things quieted down, and my dad gets a phone call. It's his ex-wife, and she says, hey, I have this niece. She's flying from Korea, and she's enrolled at the University of Washington. It's right next to your home. Can you help her please settle in? And my dad says, yes. Now, when a Korean dad says yes, it means his sons are going to do all the work. And so he taps my brother and I on the shoulder, and he's like, hey, can you go help this girl go find an apartment and, go to IKEA and everything else? And we're like, why are you doing this? And why are you doing this to us? and the way that Korean dads handle this is they just go, just go do it. And so then we reluctantly go, okay, well, out of respect for our dad, we're going to do this. And, for the next 4 years, anytime this girl had a friend that was flying in from Korea, my dad would go pick her up, drive the two of them around to make sure that they had a good time. Anytime this girl needed anything, my dad took care of her needs. Well, Thanksgiving rolls around, and in the U.S., Thanksgiving dinner, it's a really important time. And my dad comes to my brother and I, and he says, how do you feel about this? And of course, we were like, why are you doing this? And of course, he went, just go pick her up. And so then we have Thanksgiving dinner. Every time this girl's plate is finished, my dad says, would you like more food? Anytime she finishes her drink, he tops up her drink. And, after she left home, we had this debriefing session. And I looked at my dad and I was like, why do you do this? Like, you don't have to, right? And he said something profound. He said, I think God is a genius. And I asked him why. He said, when I treat this girl well, it makes me feel so good. It makes me feel so good. I think if God didn't forgive, it would kill him. I'm thinking about all the stuff that we as humanity do to God. All of the things that we do to each other, all the things that we do to his creation, and God's response is, I give you Jesus. My dad told me that night, hey, do you know my ex-wife has a twin sister, and that girl is her daughter. And it just blew my mind. I was like, of course, that's why there's such a strong resemblance. And for my dad, every time he serves this girl, he's looking into the eyes of his ex-wife. Bitterness, it didn't fix my dad's relationship with his ex-wife. She never came back and said, hey, I didn't realize how good of a man you are. Let's try and work this out. See, my dad forgiving, it didn't fix his relationship, but it did heal him. So this girl goes back to Korea, and she graduates, and a little while later, she sent my dad this package in the mail. And as he opened up the package, there was this letter that said, Dear Seattle Dad. And she went to talk about how much he meant to her in all that he did for her. And enclosed in this gift was this Korean necktie. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Korean fashion, but there was this bright pink necktie with purple stripes, and encrusted or embedded in the necktie were these plastic fake diamonds. And when the light would hit the necktie just right, it would blind you. And, as Kevin Hart says, he should have bought another one just like him and throw them both in the trash. It was bad. And I remember my dad, any chance he got, he would wear this necktie with pride, and he would stick his chest out and walk around church, and I was just like, put it away, put it away. My dad embraced this idea of forgiveness, and as a result, his family grew. And I just want to share this message with you as Burwood Community Church. As you practice this idea of forgiveness, may your family grow. In closing, there's this QR code. Hope Channel put together this resource called Forgive to Live. And this QR code we'll send you to the landing page if you're interested in going through that journey as well. I want to give a disclaimer. As you work through this material, it's going to ask you really hard questions because the idea of forgiveness, like, it requires personal responsibility. It requires personal responsibility. And so it is a challenge to work through, but there's gold in this content. And so if you're interested, you can scan the QR code and go through that journey. May God bless you as you consider his word.